Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Valerie Roop, Executive Director of the Partnership for the National Trail System, or PNTS, as you'll hear us referred to often. I use she, her pronouns. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Piscataway people. PNTS recognizes that land acknowledgements are an important first step to acknowledge that we are on stolen Indigenous lands. Please check out the link in the chat where you can explore the native lands you currently reside on, and let us know in the chat what lands you are joining us from. As folks share and reflect on that, we will get started. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Partnership for the National Trail System, we're a small nonprofit that is a collective voice, resource provider, and hub for exchange, learning, and action for the National Trail System. As the only 501c3 nonprofit organization focused on the 30 national scenic and historic trails, PNTS brings together professionals, leaders, and trail and hiking enthusiasts to promote a thriving, accessible, and inclusive national trail system for all. The Partnership for the National Trail System is proud to present today's mini briefing webinar, Historic and Cultural Sites on Public Lands, National Park Conservation Association's 2022 Legislative Priorities. Today's session is a wonderful opportunity to learn about the National Park Conservation Association's legislative priorities prior to Hike the Hill. For those of you who may not be familiar with Hike the Hill, it is a joint effort between American Hiking Society and the Partnership for the National Trail System that bring together the trails and hiking communities to advance shared trail priorities for congressional and federal agency leaders, including trails funding, public lands management and conservation, equitable access, and other top priority issues that sustain trails and improve access to public lands. We encourage you to register to join us at Hike the Hill, taking place virtually this year. This year at the 25th, it is the 25th annual Hike the Hill. We will hold a series of briefings during the week of January 24th, followed by group meetings from February 14th through 18th, generally from between 2 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to anyone that registered following the live presentation. I'm excited to welcome Alan Spears to share information about National Park Conservation Association's legislative priorities related to historic and heritage sites on public lands, as well as his insights about what to look for in the next legislative session. Alan will also touch on how justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion relate to constituency expansion for national trails and public lands. The presentation will be about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about another 15 more minutes at the end for questions and answers for our presenter. As we go, please put any questions you may have into the chat. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Alan Spears, the Senior Director of Cultural Resources with the National Parks Conservation Association. Alan joined the National Parks Conservation Association in May 1999 as an intern for the Enhancing Cultural Diversity Program. In that capacity, he helped manage the National Parks Community Partners Program, a 6-city effort to better connect racially and ethnically diverse groups and individuals to national parks. He currently serves as a lobbyist for the Government Affairs Department, an expert on the intersectionality of race, equity, and inclusion and national park advocacy, and as NPCA's in-house historian. And now I will hand it off to Alan.
Well, Valerie, I just wanted to say thank you, and my thanks to the Partnership for the National Trail System for allowing me this space. It's great to be with you all this afternoon, and I will go on for about 15 minutes, giving you my insights about historic and cultural resources in the national parks, the connection to the National Historic Trails Program. There will not be a quiz at the end of this, but hopefully there will be some questions, answers, and interaction. The bio was pretty straight up, but I would share with you also that I've been with the National Parks Conservation Association now for going on 23 years. And I think the mission and vision of the National Parks Conservation Association is really righteous. It is to protect and enhance America's national parks for current and future generations. And you can give us a visit if you care to at www.npca.org. But do be careful, because when you type in those initials NPCA, it also stands for the National Police Canine Association and the National Precast Concrete Association. So make sure you're on the site that's got the green logo with the 2 bears. That's us. I want to start off by sharing with you a story about the National Historic Trail that I know best, which is the Selma to Montgomery Trail. and the incredible stories that are behind that. In 1965, at the start of that year, just 2% of the African Americans who lived in Dallas County, Alabama, were registered to vote. And in neighboring Lowndes County, that percentage actually dropped to 0. African American folks attempting to register to vote faced a variety of challenges to their doing so. Some were legal, some, and a lot of it was extrajudicial violence that was inflicted upon people who were trying to vote. So one of the solutions was on March 7th, 1965, former Congressman John Lewis, just passed away, I think it was last year, led about 600 nonviolent marchers from the Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma, Alabama, and they headed through the streets of Selma to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, intent on marching the 54 miles east to Montgomery in a nonviolent protest for voting rights. Folks know, because I think some of the most compelling images to come out of the US Civil Rights Movement were taken that day, Bloody Sunday. The marchers were met and opposed by lines of Alabama state troopers and other law enforcement officials who violently disrupted the march and beat the protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. What is maybe not so fully realized is that those groups, along with citizens, actually continued to beat and accost protesters all the way back to Brown's AME Church. Now, John Lewis and Hosea Williams were up front, and I got to meet John Lewis a couple of times, and I heard him tell this story. If you ever look at the photographs of Congressman Lewis on that bridge, you will see he was wearing a very smart trench coat. And he liked to point out that he was wearing a backpack before backpacks were popular. And in that backpack, he had an apple, a toothbrush, and a book, because he figured that before the day was over, he was going to be arrested. He did not calculate that he would be beaten to within an inch of his life, as he was. And as he was standing on that bridge next to Hosea Williams on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and he was looking forward to that line of Alabama state troopers with sticks in hands, mounted law enforcement with dogs, all looking to attack and disrupt this nonviolent protest. John Lewis turned to Hosea Williams and said, "Hosea, can you swim?" Looking over the edge of the Alabama River. And Hosea looked back at John and said, "No, John, can you?" And John said, "No, Hosea, I can't." And they realized at that point in time that they couldn't go back. They weren't going to jump over the sides of the bridge into the Alabama River. The only place that they could go was forward into history. Second march was organized just a few days later with Martin Luther King leading that one, but that also faced resistance at the hands of local law enforcement, and Martin Luther King and other leaders called off that march. The third march, the one that actually did make it through to Selma, then began on March 21st, 1965. It was broken down into about 5 segments because it's a long way to get from Selma to Montgomery. And the Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail, established in 1996, commemorates the route, people, and the resources that are associated with that 1965 voting rights march. Now, there are a wide variety of national park types: national historic sites, national military parks, but the National Historic Trails, I think, allow for the Park Service to more capably interpret some of these stories, especially when they don't fit neatly into a box or into a park boundary. The Selma to Montgomery Trail, for instance, contains at least 2 National Park Service visitor contact stations, one in Lounsboro and then the other in Selma. I think as of 2 years ago, they were working and perhaps have completed one in downtown Montgomery. So lots of opportunity to engage the public via the National Park Service. But they also contain a number of other resources, including the farmsteads of the African Americans who opened up their property to the marchers. Again, you have a march that was broken down into 5 segments. People would need places to stay. There are not a lot of hotels along that route, and there weren't any that were accepting African Americans. And so these Black family farmers opening up their property to these marchers was an incredibly important part of that story. The George Washington Carver neighborhood in Selma is a part of the Selma to Montgomery Trail. Brown's Chapel AME that I've already mentioned, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Alabama State Capitol. All these are resources that are contained within the National Historic Trail. And that's why I think National Historic Trails are really significant components of our 21st century preservation toolkit. because they, again, another type of national park that will allow the National Park Service to be much more flexible in the way that they protect and promote the resources. Now, the National Park Service has over 400 units in the current national park system. 2/3 of those sites are historic and cultural sites, and then the other 1/3 of large landscape national park units are chock full of historic and cultural resources. So technically speaking, the National Park Service 100% is in the history and culture business, and they didn't get there by accident. The order was given in the Organic Act of the National Park System in 1916 that they need to protect not just the natural and scenic and recreational resources, but the historic and cultural resources to be found within a park's boundary as well. So it's important to remember that. But also, as we talk about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, what we found at NPCA and what I've found throughout my career is that it's sometimes easier to hook people of color on historic matters than the natural resources that the National Park Service protects, and which you guys are also interested in protecting and preserving and advocating on behalf of. There are any number of Black and brown people who love up close and personal experiences with dynamic megafauna. I am one of them. But I'm also interested in the Tuskegee Airmen. I'm also interested in Frederick Douglass and Mary McLeod Bethune, civil rights history, and Black patriots in the American Revolutionary War. And it sort of tugs at my heartstrings to know that the National Park Service, by virtue of the sites that they manage and the stories and resources that they help interpret and protect, is one of the largest stewards of African American history in the country. I think that's pretty neat. Some of the sites that are also in the National Park System that are very important, just so that you are aware, include things like the Frederick Douglass Home here in my hometown of Washington, D.C., but they also include some sites that you might know or not know or not recognize by name. For example, Fort Davis in West Texas is the site of the location where all 4 regiments of the Buffalo Soldiers or the Black regular troops were stationed, not at one time, but between 1868 and 1890. The 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry and the 24th and 25th U.S. Infantry were all stationed at Fort Davis in West Texas. And I think that there are a variety of stories that can be told there. It's the story of the route that many African Americans followed from slave to soldier to citizen. There's also the story about westward expansion and settlement and the role that African Americans played in that gets captured at Fort Davis. And then you've got the opportunity also to have more challenging conversations about what those Black men in blue uniforms, how they were interacting with and what they were doing to Indigenous and First Nations populations in the American Southwest. Fort Davis does, I think, a decent job of tackling that very complex history. Now, for the National Parks Conservation Association, my organization, it gives us an opportunity to engage with a broader, more diverse constituency when we are able to offer up these parks and these stories to people. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have had some success in helping the National Park Service to broaden and diversify its constituency, especially through the Obama years, when I was able to work with the administration on a variety of new park designations, including the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument in Birmingham, Alabama, the Pullman National Monument in Chicago, and my first national monument, as well as President Obama's first national monument designation, Fort Monroe in Virginia. And all of these stories have distinct African-American historic and cultural elements that they help to protect and to preserve. We want to talk a little bit now about the policy forecast for the second session of the 117th Congress, and to give you some sense of what we're looking at in terms of how cultural resources and national parks and public lands might play into that. And I'm so happy that you guys are continuing to do the advocacy. We need as many people engaging with our congressional representatives as possible, especially in these times. And I do think, as hard as the road is sometimes, there is sometimes strong bipartisan support to be had for public lands initiatives. We're going to see if we can't wrangle a little bit of that out of the second session of the 117th Congress, or if we will succumb to the strong partisan nature and bickering that's going on up on Capitol Hill right now. And I hope that we are successful. Just want to let you know, just from more of an updated perspective with recent news, folks may already have this information. Thanks to Omicron and the surge that's going on here in the District of Columbia and the Mid-Atlantic, most congressional staff are now working from home. They will be teleworking or working remotely through the rest of this month, most likely. And that could have impact on calendar appointments and scheduling of events even into February as people try to figure out how they can remain safe. We are also expecting the House to be busy with public lands bills and oversight hearings. Not entirely sure if Senate Energy and Natural Resources will match up on their side. The Senate has always been a more deliberative body, but the House we expect to be very busy as our Democratic friends try to clear their slate of initiatives and bills in anticipation of the 118th Congress and, quite frankly, a change of power. Now, we are hoping for a public lands omnibus, maybe a minibus at the end of this year. There are no guarantees, but I always like to put forward my plan of magic and wonder and hope that we will be able to get to a point where we can have that kind of large public lands omnibus bill that would allow us to continue the work of diversifying the national park system through the incorporation of new national heritage areas and new park sites. And the legislative priorities, well, the priorities at this point in time, we don't necessarily have bills yet for NPCA would be the development and designation of a site in the Mississippi Delta to commemorate the life and legacy of Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley. Folks may be aware that Emmett Till was 14 years old when he traveled to Mississippi to visit relatives and was murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman at Bryant's grocery store in Money, Mississippi. His mother, Mamie Till Mobley, spent the rest of her life seeking justice for her murdered son. And we think that's a story that's worth telling. For those who do have television sets and are interested in such things, you know that the Women of the Movement television series aired last week, and it'll have 2 additional episodes moving forward that highlight the story of Mamie Till Mobley. We'd like to see a national park developed there. Last year, we did get the Rosenwald Special Resources Study through both the House and the Senate. It was signed into law at literally the last moment by President Trump. And that authorizes the National Park Service to take a look at the best ways to commemorate the life and legacy of Julius Rosenwald, Jewish American philanthropist and the son of German Jewish immigrants, who wound up meeting Booker T. Washington, and the two of them hit together essentially on a scheme to provide educational opportunities for African American children in a segregated South. And from about 1912 to 1932, Mr. Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the associations that they established helped to build more than 5,300 schools in the South for African Americans. And it's an incredible story because these are some of the first permanent educational facilities that these communities in southern states had ever seen. And what it allowed for was for students to remain in school on a regular basis, to learn from some of the best teachers that were available at that time, and then to move on to high school and then college and perhaps first professional school. And you have a number of people who are graduating from Rosenwald schools in the late 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, who then go on to provide that expanded African-American middle class that supports the civil rights movement, that modern version of the American civil rights movement. And Rosenwald School graduates include people like Congressman John Lewis, and then Pulitzer Prize winning or award winning columnist Eugene Robinson. If folks are watching Morning Joe, Mr. Robinson is oftentimes a guest on that television show, and poet and activist Maya Angelou. But it's the thousands of other people who graduated from Rosenwald schools whose names we might never know, who also played a very large part in that history. Now, we did pass the bill. We don't have any legislation, but we are going to be working with the Park Service to help speed them on their way of conducting that special resource study so that once we get that done and returned, hopefully with positive findings, we can then press for the introduction of a direct or a designation bill to create a site for Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools. So we're excited about that. The last thing that I'd mention, but it's not the only other thing that's on my list, is Defense of the National Heritage Area program. Heritage areas are an unsung program managed by the National Park Service, but they are not considered to be units of the National Park System. There are about 55 of them right now, with more pending potentially, and they enable local experts to more capably tell their part of the American experience. protecting, preserving, and interpreting resources that are regionally distinct and nationally significant. And one of my favorite is the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area. And I like that one because it's just on the border of New York and Canada. And it is one of the last parts of the United States that Harriet Tubman took her folks on the Underground Railroad to before they crossed over to freedom into Canada in the 1850s. And it's a very powerful story. It's a very powerful place to be. And you can learn about folks that made that trip over the railroad bridge from the United States into Canada, from a slaveholding country into a country that promised them freedom and liberty. And they made it with their eyes shut because they were afraid that at any moment their wagon might be turned around, their party might be captured and turned around. And that that legacy is being protected and preserved by folks who run national heritage areas. So we're looking to make sure that heritage area funding is expanded, that it isn't cut. I think we've gotten past that point where we're going to see cuts or threats to the heritage area budget. But the program is set to receive about $27 million in this budget, should we ever get a budget. And we're looking to see about $40 million ultimately for the National Heritage Area Program so that we can feed the 55, but also judiciously add new national heritage areas. Because not every place needs to be a national park. And again, just like the National Historic Trail System, heritage areas can provide a bit more flexibility for locals to maintain control of their resources and their property, but also to provide interpretation and resource protection that's at the Secretary of the Interior's level or standards. So we like that program and we'll be working on that. I think what I would want to share with you, just maybe in closing out, before we get to questions and comments or rebuttal if we need it, is that we are in a very, very challenging time right now. But I also think that there have been examples that I've seen where Congress can actually come together and do good work, especially on behalf of public lands. That is probably not a high percentage play given what's going on Capitol Hill these days, but some room does exist for the cultivation of deep bipartisan constituencies that can help drive success on agendas that I think are important to both NPCA and the Partnership for National Trails, for the National Trail System. And what I would encourage you to do, based on my experience, is to continue to work with your community groups and to make sure that you are feeding congressional representatives with all the information that they need, and doing that in a way that would hook them on the responsibility that they have to make sure that our public lands are well funded, well managed, and well cared for by the American public. And this business that we're in right now could get harder over the next couple of years, but that's the reason why we need to make sure we are doubling our efforts to ensure that we can be as effective as we need to be on behalf of these public lands that we care about so much. And with that, we've been a little bit all over the place, but I'll stop now with the presentation portion of this, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments or hear anything that folks have to share that I could learn a little bit from. Kara?
Thank you so much, Alan. We don't have any questions in the chat at the moment, but if anyone has any, please feel free to put them in the chat, or because it's a smaller group, you are welcome to unmute yourself and say your comment or question verbally as well. I'll wait just a couple minutes and see if we have any questions.
And if we don't, I can commiserate with my friend Ron Tipton. We're both very disappointed Ravens fans this year.
Hi, Alan. It's good to see you again. It's Brendan from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy.
Hey.
I have a question, particularly in the context of recognizing the histories of historical contributions of under-recognized and underserved communities, and how to elevate those stories that some of us just came from a conversation on historic trails in particular, and how there are many historical trail proposals that from some perspectives just commemorate more white and colonial history and don't necessarily lift up stories of African-American communities or indigenous communities, et cetera. And so for those of us who are engaged in that, including NPCA, how do we find those stories that should be commemorated, that should be celebrated and shared, that maybe don't bubble up to the consciousness of many of the people who are seeking to use this particular act or these particular acts?
Yeah, I got it, Brendan. That's a good question. It's been my experience that the stories are out there, and most often they're not buried underneath tons and tons of clutter. It's just the willingness and the ability of people to listen, but then also, quite frankly, I think when you begin to work with Black and Brown people about making history more inclusive, more just, more equitable, it can be a very controversial thing that can easily put people out of their comfort zones. Because when you start talking about justice and you start talking about equity, usually that leads to conversations about past inequities, where things have not gone well, where resources have not been shared, where stories have been deliberately overlooked or neglected. And so oftentimes before you get to the history, you've got to get to the healing and you've got to do some repair. And I was just out in Arizona. I've done one COVID era trip, and I went out there to meet with people from the State Preservation Office. And they're going through similar things where they've got a number of Indigenous and First Nations groups that want to work on historic preservation, but they still feel in 2021 that they're not being fully listened to. And so I think it is developing programs, developing content that lean in the direction of almost going overboard to find these stories. But I would also give you this advice. You always, always, always have to ask the question. And I learned this in a women's studies class that I took thousands of years ago when I was an undergraduate. It's possible at this point in time, if you were covering a large subject like the American Civil War or the Second World War, to conclude that Indigenous people, women, working class folks, African Americans had nothing whatsoever to do or contribute to those historical storylines or threads. It's possible, but it's not likely. And so I think as you put together programs on stuff, you've got to look at who's presenting, what are they presenting on? And if you don't have anything in your lineup that at least takes a look at, we're not even sure what we're looking to find out, but we know we need to have a little bit more diversity because we think that that's the case, I think you're asking the question, and that's the way to start.
Thank you so much, Alan. We do have another question here in the chat from Travis. You stated that you felt an omnibus public lands bill might be introduced this session. Do you have any ideas who might be the leads in Congress?
Well, the leads will be the majority party heads in both the House and the Senate, and also the people who are controlling the committees of jurisdiction. So for most of the stuff that we're working on, that would be Senate Energy and Natural Resources, and then House Natural Resources. So that's Mr. Manchin in the Senate, and that's Mr. Grijalva in the House. Now, the concept of public lands, and if you need to file this under stuff you already know, I apologize. But the idea is that sometimes in a very hostile partisan environment, it is difficult for one bill alone to get through. So you form a convoy or an omnibus. And the idea behind an omnibus is it's got a couple of Democratic bills, it's got a couple of Republican bills, and everybody has something to gain by that, to a point where you are able to control or neutralize the naysayers. And we've got to be real specific about this, there's a senator from out west in a certain state who often likes to put holds on individual bills. If you develop a public lands omnibus and he's getting phone calls from several of his Republican colleagues saying, listen, I got something in here that's critically important to my constituents related to public lands, it's got to go. You might be able to neutralize someone who would otherwise play around with individual bills. So the leads are going to be basically the leadership in the House and Senate, but it'll be driven by anybody who has, there's a Chisholm Trail National Historic Site bill. I'm not sure if that'll make it through regular order or not to get to a point where it could be engaged or involved in a public lands omnibus bill. But it would be, the starting point would be the folks in the House and Senate who are promoting that legislation to kick that up to the committee leads, who would then kick it up to the Democratic leads in both the House and Senate to say, this is something that's important, we want to get this thing passed. So that's how the omnibuses work. You start with the people that are introducing the legislation and then work to craft together a campaign that engages everybody in the leadership chain so that it's understood to be a priority.
Wonderful, thank you. We don't have any additional questions in the chat. So if anyone has any quick final questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute before we wrap up. Yeah, we'll go Ralph and then we'll go Ron. Ralph.
Yeah, I'm with the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Trail, for which the primary focus was recognizing French contributions to the Revolutionary War. And we go through a number of cities along the trail, I think 9 cities trail, which are smaller cities and struggling somewhat. The infrastructure of the cities not in good shape, and they're not necessarily the most happy places to go through. But we are working with the communities there, which are now majority non-white communities, to make the trails attractive to them, both in the physical sense of having good infrastructure and in the personal sense of having a story about people that are similar to those communities, Hispanic, Black communities, women and children sort of a thing. Everybody contributed during the revolution and everybody should be recognized. And we have found, of course, stories of these people and are in the process of getting those publicized. So I would say, we're in the middle of that sort of thing on the East Coast, just as you are on the West Coast, and are, I think, dealing with it constructively.
And I'm greatly admiring, Ralph, your background. I'm just noticing that now. You have a particularly good avenue of approach, given that we're coming up on the 250th anniversary for the country. And if you are not yet in touch with the America 250 Foundation, you need to figure out a way to contact either them directly, I could help with that, or with the state representatives for the states of New England and the Mid-Atlantic, heading down into Virginia, in order to make sure that your work, your efforts are being acknowledged and incorporated into that commemoration, which obviously is all anniversaries are kind of once in a lifetime, but this is going to be a big cornerstone event that's coming up in 2026. So I do hope you get an opportunity to help plan that. And of course, there are, and I'm going to be a bad historian, was it Connecticut or Rhode Island that had the regiments of African-American soldiers that followed the trail down and wound up fighting Rhode Island at Yorktown and contributed to final victory? And so that's always a good thing to roll out for people who are interested in figuring out, is this relevant to me in any way, shape, or form?
And if you look at our website, you will see paintings of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment highlighted.
This is R.G. Absher with the OVTA, Over Mountain Victory Trail Association. We also work with the Revolutionary War battle story, the campaign to the Battle of Kings Mountain. And we are now incorporating a story that's a little told story in the campaign in the Battle of Kings Mountain, is that there were Black patriots in the Battle of Kings Mountain. And in fact, some of those were fairly famous. One of them was one of the patriots that actually shot Patrick Ferguson, the British leader, at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And but those stories are a little told, but we've started incorporating those along the trail during our annual storytelling that we do, with what we call the annual March to Kings Mountain that we hold every year in the fall of the year, commemorating the March to the Battle of Kings Mountain. But the stories, and they seem to go over extremely well, and we're weaving these stories in, highlighting their contributions, which were little told in the past.
Well, maybe just in quick response to that, I think, I had mentioned the notion of healing. And I think that efforts to make history more inclusive, those are always a good thing. It just makes it more interesting. And I think it allows us to bring in more people. And I'm always fascinated by the story of, was it the Battle of Brandywine, where Patrick Ferguson had George Washington in his sights with that rifle of his? And if he had taken that shot, things might have worked out dramatically differently for all of us at this point in time, certainly for the formation of a United States of America. So yeah, Kings Mountain, I've been there once. I really enjoyed my time there. And You and I could have conversations about the strategy and tactics related to Kings Mountain and the Over the Mountain Men and their presence, and then how that led up to Yorktown final victory. I love that history. I'm letting my nerd run free.
You might like this as a little side note. We have now incorporating some of our interpretive programmings where the students come out and they assume patriot roles. And we've had students of color participate. It's been a wonderful thing. And actually teach the teacher or the interpreter about the story as an experience where they can have a hands-on kind of an experience. And it's just opened up all kinds of, I think it's maybe moving in an area, breaking down some barriers that would have been there because the imaginations of those students just really seem to bubble forth and to exude excitement in their history, knowing that they fit in or are a part of it. And when we tell them about these episodes, and then when they have a chance to come back and role play, regardless of their backgrounds, that really has helped in make them feel like more of a part of it rather than separate as being a typical Anglo-Saxon white American story, that there's a lot more to it. And there's and by those revelations, it seems to really open up a lot of fans to the trail, and I think it's a good thing.
Well, again, just a quick response on that. I think you're doing it exactly the right way, which is I could talk forever about facts and politics and all the rest of that stuff. You got to make it a little bit fun. Otherwise, why do people care? And then I think to the point that you're making also is that our history is just entirely more racially complex than we've been led to believe. And there might be some people who see that as a liability. I see that as great value adder to the way that we can talk about and engage people to care about these things. And, climbing back up on my soapbox, and then Ron, over to you, it's part of the thing that we work on at NPCA, and I worked with Ron on this kind of stuff for an awful long time, is, we're an advocacy organization for America's national parks. And so the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion stuff that we talk about, that we implement, is important because it's the right thing to do. But maybe even perhaps as important, it also helps us to win more often. If we can roll up to Capitol Hill, if you guys can go up to Capitol Hill with the biggest, broadest, most diverse constituency that you can manage of actively engaged people who say National Historic Trails matter, public lands matter, the Appalachian Trail matters, the Frederick Douglass Home matters, and you need to take care of these places, you say politely but firmly to our congressional representatives, because they matter to all people. It is a really compelling message to make. And so the diversity stuff, maybe you don't really care about civil rights history and you are stuck back in 1781 or 1864 or wherever you are, but it is in your self-interest to have the broadest, most diverse constituency that we can manage to create, moving and shaking on behalf of our public lands.
Yeah, Alan, I couldn't agree more. It's good to see you again. Thanks for doing this. Quick comment about the Washington Rochambeau. I know Ralph knows this, but Ellen Von Kerrigan, their executive director of the Washington Rochambeau Association, has been working closely with urban communities, Black communities in Philadelphia, Wilmington, and elsewhere to try to incorporate some interpretation of the Washington Rochambeau and some, connection with the trail as it goes right through their communities. And so it's another example of how we can, kind of broaden the base, so to speak. A quick question for you. We had a meeting earlier this afternoon. We were discussing Native American. How do you most effectively involve Native American tribes in looking at new opportunities for National Historic Trails? And the specific question or point that we're trying to deal with is that the Park Service has done a number of feasibility studies of National Historic Trails, primarily out of the Santa Fe office. Aaron Marr is the director there, and we had a long meeting with Aaron last week. So we want, as an advocacy group, the partnership, we want to be able to, encourage and incite more involvement by Native American interests and tribes in when some of these Western trails get proposed and they go through a feasibility study and the focus is mostly, white people going west to oversimplify it. And, the question is this, Aaron said, that's great, but he said, you got to understand for feasibility study, we're talking government to government with tribes. And so we're bringing them in. And so he was hesitant about what our role might be at that step, in the process, and not so much what happens after the feasibility study is out. So any thoughts you have about how our organization and how our various national trail nonprofit partners can work with Native Americans when some of these proposed National Historic Trails?
Yeah, Ron, it's another great question. I mean, I think that it's always interesting because I think sometimes our federal partners, and if there are any on this call, I apologize if this is a bridge too far in terms of a comment, sometimes want to narrow the conversation as opposed to expand it. And I think we need wider conversations, maybe a little bit more static, a little bit more trouble, so that you can get through that stuff at the start, as opposed to what often happens too frequently is you get to the end of a process and you hear from people that nobody ever called. And I think we all have seen instances, I know I have, where the Park Service or another federal land management agency is obligated to consult with tribes. And consultation can come in the form of an email that goes out at 6 o'clock on a Monday saying there's going to be a meeting at 5 o'clock on a Wednesday. Can you come? That's not real partnership or consultation, but it is artful box checking. So the short of it is, I think, engage with tribes from the start. Do an inventory. How many are on your board? How many are in your leadership cohort? And if you find that you are lacking, do your best to kind of engage those folks so that they've got an opportunity to help plan things from the start. And a good place to go, especially if you're looking to influence that government to government process, is the National Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. And I think they are overworked, underpaid, and there are not enough of them, but that's also a good place to start in terms of getting a very storied and deep base of knowledge about the work that's been done. And then also, because there have been just so many missteps, one of the most important things I would think is working with your tribal partners and listening to them when they tell you about things that they feel are past slights or injustices. Because it's, Band-Aids work effectively for what they're supposed to do. They don't work so well on big wounds. And if you're coming in prepared to put a Band-Aid on what has remained a gaping wound in a community, because people feel that they weren't included, were disrespected, or they were just screwed over, you need to know that. You need to begin working with them on that healing and that repair.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. Well, I think that brings us to our time for today. And thank you all so much for attending this presentation and discussion. And please join me in giving a special thank you to Alan for being here today. And I will send a follow-up email with the recording of this session, as well as any follow-up information and Alan's contact information if you'd like to continue discussing with him. And just a quick plug, please make sure to register for the 25th annual Hike the Hill. It's a joint effort between American Hiking Society and Partnership for the National Trail System. Valerie mentioned it in the intro earlier. I will also send out some information on how to register in the post email as well. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Take care.